Until recently, when people heard the word Vietnam, their mind wandered to a poor nation destroyed by decades of war. This view of Vietnam is long outdated. Today, Vietnam has become one of the biggest high-tech manufacturing hubs in the world. There is a good chance that the smartphone in your hand or the chip inside your computer was built there. Tech giants like Apple, Samsung and Intel are shifting their production to Vietnamese soil by the dozens. Many see this impressive growth as a lucky accident, a byproduct of companies fleeing the trade war between Washington and Beijing. But Vietnam didn't just accidentally become a global manufacturer, it instead studied the world economy, figured out exactly what the foreign corporations wanted, and built a system designed to match their needs. To understand Vietnam, we need to look at its geography. For over 2 millennia, this narrow strip of land has existed in the shadow of a giant. To its north lies China, a civilization that for most of human history was the undisputed superpower of the region. For thousands of years, Chinese emperors looked south and saw Vietnam not as a sovereign neighbor, but as a territory to be absorbed, civilized and controlled. For over 1,000 years, from the Han Dynasty to the Tang Dynasty, China directly ruled Vietnam. They imposed their language, their bureaucratic systems, and their Confucian philosophy. But while other cultures were entirely swallowed up by the Chinese civilization, the Vietnamese resisted. They absorbed the culture of the empire but strongly rejected the empire itself. Generation after generation, Vietnam rose up. In the year 40, the Trung sisters led a legendary rebellion that briefly drove the Chinese out. Centuries later, in 938, General Ngo Quyen shattered the southern Han fleet at the Bac Tang River by driving iron-tipped spikes into the riverbed, ending a millennium of Chinese domination. When the unstoppable Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan swept across Eurasia, conquering everything from Europe to Persia, they invaded Vietnam 3 times. Every single time the Vietnamese guerrilla tactics wore them down and drove them back. This constant struggle for survival created a very distinct national mindset. It created a society that was deeply Confucian, valuing education, meritocracy, discipline, and long-term planning, matched with a strong desire for independence. The Vietnamese learned that to survive next to giants, you cannot rely on brute force alone. You have to be smarter. You have to watch, adapt, and use your opponent's own weight against them. For centuries, this strategic patience kept Vietnam free. But in the 19th century, a new kind of empire arrived from across the ocean. A threat that possessed technology never seen before, and one that would plunge Vietnam into its darkest century yet. Vietnam has been colonized by France. The French treated the country like a giant farm, carving up its lands for rubber and rice plantations while investing little in people's education or standard of living. When that empire was finally kicked out in 1954, Vietnam didn't get peace. Instead, the country broke in half, the Western-backed capitalist South and the Northern communist one, setting the stage for the Vietnam War, one of the ugliest conflicts in modern human history. The Vietnamese people proved to be far tougher adversaries than many American politicians anticipated. Shaped by over 1,000 years of resistance, they had developed a national character of endurance, patience, and a strong will to fight for unification. America would learn this the hard way. By the time the war ended in 1975 and the country was officially reunited with the communist North, Vietnam was in ruins. More bombs had been dropped on it than on the entirety of Europe during World War II. Its fields were poisoned by chemical defoliants, its infrastructure was obliterated, and millions of its citizens were dead. The communists declared the birth of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, but what followed was not a triumphant rebirth, it was the start of an economic dark age. The new government initially imposed a rigid Soviet-style command economy. They abolished private property, wiped out the entrepreneurial merchant class, and forced farmers into state-controlled collective communes. The state dictated everything: how much rice a farmer had to hand over, the exact price of a bar of soap, and who was allowed to buy a bicycle. The results were catastrophic. Having no incentive to work hard, agricultural production collapsed. A country with some of the most fertile soil on earth was unable to feed itself. To make matters worse, Vietnam found itself entirely isolated, slapped with international trade embargoes. By the mid-1980s, the country had hit rock bottom. Per capita income was still below $100 a year, making it one of the poorest nations on the planet. By 1986, a catastrophic currency experiment sent the economy into freefall. inflation rose to 774%. The communist leadership had won the war against the world's greatest military superpower, but a decade later, they were completely losing the war against poverty. The nation had to choose, adapt or collapse entirely. And in December of 1986, inside the closed doors of the 6th National Party Congress, the revolutionaries decided to do the unexpected: adapt. They launched a reform program known as Doi Moi, which translates to renovation. Just like Deng Xiaoping did in China, Vietnam's leaders realized that they didn't need to abandon their political system to save their country, they just needed to change the economic rules. It was time to transition into a socialist-oriented market economy. Simply put, they were legalizing capitalism under a communist regime. The first step in this reform was agriculture. For a decade, farmers had to work on collective communes where no matter how hard you worked, you received the exact same compensation as everyone else. Unsurprisingly, people were unmotivated and thus unproductive. Doi Moi completely changed the system. Through a directive called Resolution 10, the government gave land use rights back to individual peasant families. The new rule was simple and effective. Families had to give a fixed quota of their crop to the state, but anything they harvested above that quota belonged to them. They could eat it or they could sell it in the open market. The results were immediate. Having a real reason to work efficiently, Vietnamese farmers transformed the countryside almost overnight. By the mid-1980s, Vietnam was importing millions of tons of food to prevent starvation. By 1989, less than 3 years after the reforms began, Vietnam hadn't just become self-sufficient, it had suddenly become one of the largest exporters of rice on the planet. With the food crisis solved and the economy stabilizing, the government focused on the next major goal: building wealth. Selling rice and coffee could feed a nation, but it could never make it rich. To build a modern economy, Vietnam needed factories, and to get factories, they had to do the unthinkable for an old-school communist state: to open their doors to foreign capitalists and invite the world's corporations on their soil. The secret to Vietnam's economic miracle lies in what's known as the China +1 strategy. For 3 decades, China was the factory of the world. But as Chinese wages began to rise and geopolitical trade wars erupted between Washington and Beijing, global corporations panicked. They realized that relying entirely on a single country for their entire supply chain was too risky. They needed a backup plan, a secondary hub that was stable, highly organized and strategically located. Vietnam was the perfect choice. Vietnam offered the global tech giants a very disciplined, highly literate young workforce and massive government investment in deep-water ports and highways. The foreign investment has transformed the country. Look at Samsung. In 2008, the South Korean tech giant opened its first major phone factory in Vietnam. Today, Samsung produces over half of its global smartphones on Vietnamese soil, turning old agricultural provinces into ultra-modern, high-tech industrial centers. In 2025 alone, Samsung Vietnam generated nearly $65 billion in revenue. And they aren't alone. Apple has moved big production lines for iPads, Apple Watches, and MacBooks to Vietnam. Semiconductor giants like Intel and Nvidia are investing billions into advanced microchip assembly and packaging facilities. Just like China before it, Vietnam started with cheap, labor-intensive manufacturing, textiles, footwear, and simple electronics as a necessary first step. But they didn't stop at making t-shirts and plastic toys. By utilizing the exact same pragmatic and experimental mindset introduced during Doi Moi, Vietnam has slowly climbed the global value chain and became an important part of the global economy. If history has proven anything, it's that you should never underestimate Vietnam. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed my video, please give it a like and consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next video.